This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 47. The founding of London, and Paul's first missionary journey begins. In Britannia, a few years after Claudius's successful invasion, victorious Roman legions had developed a strong base at Londinium, which was considered the capital, present-day Colchester. Now, in the year 46, they founded the new village of Londinium on a north bank of the river that was easy to bridge. Romans intended to stay in Britannia. Many of the locals, however, had other ideas, and we'll hear more about that in future episodes. I'll also include a link in the show notes to an illustration of Londinium. It was in that same year of 46 that Claudius named Tiberius Julius Alexander, son of Alexander the Alabarch, brother of Philo, procurator of Judea, and he would serve in that role until 48. Alexander the Alabarch had been imprisoned by the Princeps Gaius, but released when Claudius came to power. About that time, Alexander's other younger son, Marcus, was married to Bernice, Herod Agrippa's daughter. Marcus had since died in about 41. His was a prominent family in Alexandria, and his uncle was the famed philosopher Philo. Tiberius Alexander was raised Jewish, but abandoned that religion at a young age, much to his father's and uncle's chagrin. But as his father raised him for Roman civil service, ensuring he had every advantage, including language and culture, he was successful in that promising vocation. After serving as procurator in the Thebais region, south of Egypt, he now assumed the procuratorship of Judea in good order, though shortly thereafter there was a great famine in Judea. He worked with Queen Helena, who brought in grain from Egypt and distributed it to those in need. About this time, two sons of Judas the Galilean, that insurrectionist who revolted against Rome due to a census for taxation, was captured by the Roman authorities. Though Judas the Galilean was defeated, his movement continued and had morphed into something referred to as the Zealot Party. Tiberius Alexander saw to it that Simon and Jacob, sons of Judas the Galilean, the insurrectionist, were crucified in short order. He wanted to be sure that there would not be any uprisings under his watch. As we heard in earlier episodes, the Christian community in Jerusalem had faced persecutions. Early ones from Paul, who eventually became Christian, but also from Herod Agrippa, who executed James and imprisoned Simon Peter. But now, the policy among the Sanhedrin, that is, the religious leaders there, had shifted slightly. The Pharisee Gamaliel advised caution. Though there was a desire on the part of some in the Sanhedrin to continue to suppress the nascent Christian movement, Gamaliel recalled that in light of Theudas' execution and his followers disbanding, and then again that Judas the Galilean led the revolt during the times of the census, and now his sons were recently crucified, it seemed best to let this new movement, the sect of the Nazorean, die a natural death. For if it were merely another activity by misguided humans, it would die out naturally. That slight shift in policy released pressure that the Christians had been facing. Peter was still in Antioch after narrowly escaping death at the hands of Herod Agrippa, and he was eager to stay there as the leader of the community. He was assisted by Claudius, who eagerly heard Peter's preaching and his stories about Jesus. There were also prophets and teachers in Antioch. For example, Agabus, the prophet who had predicted the famine in Judea, Menachem, Herod Antipas's childhood friend who had become a Christian, and Barnabas, even Simeon, who is called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, and Paul himself, the persecutor turned witness to the risen Christ. Recently, the church in Antioch had welcomed John Mark, who was Barnabas's cousin. John Mark's mother had a house in Jerusalem, and it was the home where Peter went when he miraculously escaped Herod Agrippa's prison. When John Mark came to Antioch, he was overjoyed to see Peter again, and they caught up on news. Now, John Mark, along with his cousin Barnabas and Paul, were chosen to go on mission to tell people about what God had done in Jesus. They went to Seleucia on the coast, and from there they sailed to Cyprus, landing at Salamis. They thought Cyprus would be fertile territory for their mission, as it had a significant Jewish presence, and there were a number of Cypriots who had already become Christian. In fact, when Paul had persecuted the church in Jerusalem, some of those persecuted had fled to Cyprus. And of course, Barnabas himself was from Cyprus, and he knew the area well. He and Paul had already visited there, as we heard in episode 34. Now on this journey in Cyprus, they met a certain Nason, who became a believer as well. They made their way across the island and then sailed from Paphos to Perga in Pamphylia. At that point, John Mark departed them, and he went back to Jerusalem to be with his mother at her home there. Paul was disappointed at John Mark's decision, but he let him go without much antagonism. Paul and Barnabas continued on from Perga and arrived at Antioch in Pisidia, where they entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and spoke about Jesus being the Messiah. They were well received and invited back to speak on the following Sabbath. Many Jews and converts to Judaism began to follow Paul and Barnabas, who continued to exhort them to remain faithful to the grace of God. On the following Sabbath, it seemed the whole city had gathered at the synagogue of Antioch in Pisidia to hear Paul and Barnabas. But some of the Jews were upset at this, because Paul and Barnabas were preaching something not aligned with their way of thinking. They argued that Jesus was not the Messiah, and they made their points forcefully. The discussion grew heated as each side contradicted the other, until finally Paul and Barnabas said that if the Jews would not accept this message, God would be sending them to the Gentiles, and they would be receptive. Not only that, Paul and Barnabas saw that their understanding was even prophesied in Scripture, where it says, quote, "I have made you a light to the Gentiles." And by quoting that Scripture, this had the effect of delighting the Gentiles and angering some of the Jews in the synagogue who would not accept that Jesus was the Messiah. For their part, those people incited some of the prominent women of the city and not a few of the leading men to expel Paul and Barnabas from that territory. So together the pair left and made their way to Iconium in Galatia. Next time, we'll turn our attention back to Rome, where Messalina's envy for a spectacular garden drives another complicated and adulterous scheme.